The boardroom on the third floor of St. Albans Memorial Hospital was full. Department heads lined both sides of the long conference table. Camille Ashford, CEO of Ashford Healthcare Group, sat at the far end with a leather portfolio open in front of her. And at the head of the table, Dr. Gerald Pratt, the hospital director, stood with his hand extended toward the back of the room, where a man in a gray technician's uniform stood alone against the wall. Pratt's voice carried the kind of amusement that only power could afford. "This is what happens when we let a wrench-turner question certified surgeons." Laughter rolled through the room. Nathan Mercer did not move. He did not blink. Then the door opened. A 9-year-old girl walked in, holding a painting still damp from art class, scanning the room until she found him. Her face lit up. She crossed the floor and called out loud enough for every person at that table to hear. "Dr. Mercer, look what I made!" The laughter stopped. Every head turned. Pratt stared at the girl, then at Nathan. Camille set her pen down. No one in that room knew the child had just told the truth. The man and entire boardroom just laughed, had held a title none of them had ever earned. Why would a little girl call her own father doctor? And why did it make the whole room go silent? 3 weeks before that meeting, Nathan Mercer pulled into the staff parking lot at St. Albans Memorial at 5:37 in the morning. The lot was almost empty. The only cars belonged to overnight nurses finishing the graveyard shift and a few residents who had never left. Nathan parked in the far corner, the same spot he had used for 3 years, grabbed his tool bag from the passenger seat, and walked through the side entrance that led directly to the basement corridor. The biomedical equipment room sat at the end of that corridor, past the laundry intake and the storage cages. It was a narrow space, maybe 12 feet by 20, lined with metal shelving units, stacked with circuit boards, replacement modules, calibration tools, and bins of sorted connectors. The air smelled like solvent and machine oil. A single fluorescent fixture buzzed overhead. This was where Nathan spent his days calibrating ventilators, inspecting anesthesia delivery systems, replacing infusion pump modules, running voltage checks on patient monitors. He was the only full-time biomedical equipment technician on staff. The hospital employed over 800 people. Nathan knew fewer than 10 of them by name. He worked with a kind of precision that no one in the hospital understood. When he calibrated a ventilator, he did not simply match the factory specifications. He cross-referenced the output against patient weight protocols, tidal volume standards, and peak inspiratory pressure thresholds. When he inspected an anesthesia machine, he tested not just the mechanical function, but the pharmacokinetic delivery accuracy, the rate at which the machine dispensed sevoflurane or desflurane relative to the vaporizer setting. These were not things a technician was trained to do. These were things a surgeon would notice. No one noticed. He kept a leather wallet in his back pocket. Inside, behind his driver's license, there was a photograph. In it, a younger Nathan stood in a white coat beside a woman with auburn hair and the same quiet smile he sometimes still wore when he was not thinking about it. Both of them had stethoscopes around their necks. Behind them, slightly out of focus, the Johns Hopkins logo was visible on a glass door. Her name had been Meredith. She had been an anesthesiologist. She had died 4 years ago, on an operating table at a hospital in Virginia, connected to a machine that had not been properly maintained. The hospital knew. The director had signed the maintenance reports. Nathan never showed the photograph to anyone. He never talked about it. Every morning, when he sat down at his workbench, he reached back, felt the wallet against his hip, and began his day. That evening, he drove to the Savannah Arts Academy Annex on Habersham Street and picked up his daughter. Sophie climbed into the truck with a canvas bag full of brushes and a streak of cerulean blue across her left cheek. She talked the entire ride home about the landscape assignment, about how her teacher said her horizon line was the best in the class, about whether clouds were actually white or just reflecting light. Nathan listened, nodding at the right moments, asking the right questions. He asked her what color the sky had been when she started painting. She said it was gray, but she painted it blue anyway because gray was boring. He almost laughed. At home, Sophie sat on the kitchen counter while Nathan chopped onions. She swung her legs and watched him work. Then she asked the question she asked maybe once a month, always casually, always without warning. "Dad, do you miss being Dr. Mercer?" Nathan's hands stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, and then he said quietly, "I'm still Dr. Mercer, Soph." Just a quieter version. Sophie accepted this the way she accepted everything her father said. Completely. She hopped down from the counter and started setting the table without being asked, placing the forks on the left the way her father had taught her, folding the napkins into triangles because her mother used to do it that way. Or so her father had told her once, on a night when the house was very quiet, and the photograph on the dresser caught the last of the light. In the bottom drawer of his workbench at the hospital, Nathan kept a notebook. Black cover, unlined pages, filled with entries written in small, careful handwriting. Each entry included a date, an equipment serial number, a measured reading, and the corresponding value listed in the hospital's official maintenance log. In 3 years, he had recorded over 400 discrepancies. The most recent entry, circled in red, concerned the anesthesia unit in operating room 3 pressure variance at 14% above safe threshold. The official log listed the machine as within normal limits. Below the entry, in the margin, Nathan had written 3 dates, the dates of the 3 reports he had filed through the hospital's internal system. Beside each date, a single word, denied. The week Camille Ashford arrived at St. Albans Memorial. The sky over Savannah was flat and gray, and the hospital had been scrubbed to a shine that fooled no one who worked there. Her motorcade, 2 black SUVs and a sedan, pulled into the main entrance at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning. An assistant held the door. A second assistant carried a briefcase. A third trailed behind with a tablet, already cross-referencing financial reports against the itinerary. Camille stepped into the lobby and did not smile. She was 33 years old, the youngest CEO in the history of Ashford Healthcare Group, and she had inherited the position from her father 18 months ago, under circumstances that half the board still resented. She ran 14 hospitals across 6 states, and she ran them the way her father had taught her, by the numbers. If the numbers were clean, the hospital was clean. If the numbers were not clean, someone was fired before dinner. Dr. Gerald Pratt met her at the main entrance, with a handshake that lasted exactly the right amount of time, and a smile that had been rehearsed in the mirror that morning. He was 57, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who wore authority the way other men wore cologne, generously and with complete confidence that everyone around him found it pleasant. He had been director of St. Albans for 9 years, and in that time he had never received a negative evaluation. His reports were always on time, his budgets always balanced, his patient satisfaction scores were always in the top quartile. He gave Camille the tour, the surgical suites gleaming under halogen lights, the new imaging wing, funded by a capital campaign he had personally overseen, the pediatric floor, freshly painted, with donated artwork on the walls. Every department head they passed greeted Camille with deference, and Pratt with something closer to caution. When they walked past the basement corridor, Camille glanced through the narrow window in the stairwell door. She saw a man in gray bent over a screen, his back to the glass. "Who handles biomedical equipment?" she asked. Pratt did not slow down. "A technician, keeps to himself. Nothing remarkable." They moved on. That afternoon, Pratt found Dr. Joan Whitfield alone in the anesthesiology break room. Joan was 45, calm under pressure, respected by every nurse on the surgical floor. She was also the only department head who had raised concerns about equipment reliability in the past 2 years, concerns that Pratt had intercepted and buried before they reached any written record. Pratt closed the door behind him. His voice was conversational, almost friendly, which made it worse. "The CEO is here for 3 days, he said. "If anyone mentions equipment issues during her visit, Joan, I will reassign your entire departmental budget to orthopedics by Friday." Joan looked at him. She did not argue. She never did. She poured her coffee, nodded once, and left the room. In the hallway, her hands were shaking. She pressed them against her thighs until they stopped. Camille reviewed the quarterly reports that evening in the director's conference room. Revenue was up 4%. Operating costs were down 6%. Equipment maintenance budget showed consistent allocation with 0 variance over 36 months. Malpractice claims were at a 5-year low. She closed the folder and told Pratt, "Numbers are clean. That's the minimum, Dr. Pratt." He smiled and refilled her water glass. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday at 10. All department heads were required to attend, along with senior nursing staff and the director's administrative team. Camille sat at the head of the table. Pratt stood beside a projection screen. The agenda was routine operational updates, staffing metrics, quality indicators. Then Pratt changed the subject. He pulled up an email on the screen. It had been sent 2 days earlier by Nathan Mercer to the hospital's administrative board, bypassing Pratt's office entirely. The email requested an independent inspection of all equipment in Operating Room 3, citing a 14% pressure variance in the anesthesia delivery system. Pratt read the email aloud, slowly, emphasizing certain words. "A biomedical technician," he said, pausing for effect, "is now telling board-certified surgeons which machines are safe to use." The room laughed. A senior orthopedic surgeon leaned back in his chair and said, "Maybe he should scrub in next time." The laughter grew louder. Nathan stood at the back of the room. He had been summoned 10 minutes before the meeting with no explanation. He wore his gray uniform. His hands were at his sides. He did not smile. He did not shift his weight. He waited until the laughter faded, and then he spoke. One sentence. "The pressure variance in OR 3 is 14% above threshold. That's not an opinion. That's a number." Pratt cut him off before the room could process the words. "And your job is to fix what we tell you to fix, not to think." He turned to Camille. "I apologize for this disturbance, Miss Ashford." Camille was watching Nathan, not Pratt. She studied the technician's face the way she studied balance sheets, looking for the thing that did not add up. She saw no fear, no embarrassment, no anger. She saw restraint, the kind of restraint that came from choosing silence, not from having nothing to say. She noticed it. She filed it. She said nothing. Nathan turned and walked out of the conference room. No one opened the door for him. He opened it himself, stepped through, and let it close behind him without a sound. 2 days later, Camille was walking through the recovery ward on an unscheduled inspection when the alarm started. A patient monitor beside bed 7 began cycling through error codes, its screen flashing yellow, then red. The attending nurse called for the on-duty physician, who arrived and found the monitor unresponsive to resets. He paged biomedical support. Nathan arrived in under 3 minutes. He moved to the monitor without greeting anyone, opened the side panel, checked the internal connections, and identified the fault, a degraded sensor relay, in less than 60 seconds. But he did not stop there. He paused, looked at the SPO2 readout on the screen, then looked at the patient. Something in the patient's color did not match the number. He reached over and manually checked the pulse oximeter probe on the patient's finger, pressing 2 fingers against the nail bed, tilting the hand toward the overhead light. Then he turned to the nurse. "The SPO2 reading has been displaying 96. Actual saturation is closer to 89. Check the patient now." The nurse hesitated. Nathan did not repeat himself. He simply held her gaze until she moved. The attending physician returned to the bedside, ran a manual assessment, and confirmed the patient's oxygen levels had been dropping for at least 20 minutes, masked by a faulty sensor feeding incorrect data to the monitor. They intervened immediately. A respiratory therapist was paged. Supplemental oxygen was administered. The patient stabilized within the hour. Without Nathan's intervention, the decline would have continued undetected until it became a code blue. The nurse who had watched Nathan work came to him afterward, near the supply closet at the end of the hall. "How did you know the reading was off?" she asked. Nathan zipped his tool bag. The patient's nail beds were cyanotic. The number on the screen said 96. One of those was wrong. He left without waiting for a response. Camille had seen all of it. She had been standing in the corridor, 6 feet from the door, watching through the glass partition. She had watched Nathan bypass the obvious hardware fault and go straight to the clinical implication, something no equipment technician should have thought to do. A technician fixes the machine. Nathan had read the patient. She turned to Dr. Joan Whitfield, who had been walking with her. "Your technician, how long has he worked here?" Joan hesitated, choosing her words carefully. 3 years. He's different from anyone I've seen in that role." Camille tilted her head. "Different how?" Joan glanced down the corridor, then back. Her voice dropped slightly. "He reads equipment the way surgeons read patients." Camille said nothing. She watched Nathan walk down the hall toward the stairwell. The attending physician called after him. "Hey, thanks." Nathan did not turn around. He raised one hand slightly, without breaking stride, and disappeared through the door. The hallway felt quieter after he left. Camille stood there a moment longer. For the first time since arriving at St. Albans Memorial, she was looking at someone without thinking about their title. The emergency came on a Friday, just before noon. A 46-year-old woman arrived at St. Albans via ambulance with a ruptured cerebral aneurysm subarachnoid hemorrhage, grade 4. The neurosurgery team was activated. Operating room 3 was prepped. Dr. Joan Whitfield was assigned as the anesthesiologist. The surgery began at 12:22. For the first 40 minutes, everything held. The surgical team worked in focused silence, navigating the delicate vasculature at the base of the brain, isolating the ruptured vessel. Joan monitored the ventilator, the gas flow, the patient's blood pressure, the end tidal readings, all stable. Then the anesthesia machine in operating room 3 stuttered. The airway pressure reading climbed slowly at first, then in a sharp spike that did not correspond to any change in ventilation settings. Joan adjusted the flow rate. The pressure continued to rise. She switched modes. The machine did not respond correctly. The servo valve, the component that regulated gas delivery pressure, was drifting, exactly the way Nathan had documented in his reports. The very failure he had predicted 3 times in writing. The patient's blood pressure dropped. Heart rate climbed. The lead surgeon looked up from the microscope. "Joan, what's happening?" Joan's voice was controlled but tight. "Pressure regulation failure. The machine isn't holding." The surgical tech's eyes went wide. The circulating nurse was already on the phone. "Get the biomed tech, now." Nathan walked into operating room 3 4 minutes later. He had been in the basement when the page came. He was already carrying a sealed parts case. He did not touch the anesthesia machine first. He looked at the physiological monitor: heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, capnography. He processed the numbers the way only a clinician could, reading them not as isolated values, but as a constellation that told a story about what was happening inside the patient's body. Then he turned to Joan. "Switch to manual ventilation. The servo valve is drifting. It won't hold calibration under load." His voice was as calm as if he were reading a weather report. Joan looked at him. In that instant, she understood something she had suspected for 3 years but never confirmed. This man did not just understand machines. He understood medicine. She disconnected the automated circuit and switched to manual bag ventilation without a word of protest. Nathan opened the side panel of the anesthesia unit, removed the failing servo valve, and installed a replacement from the parts case he had carried in. The machine cycled through its diagnostic check. Pressure readings stabilized. Gas flow normalized. The patient's vitals settled within 90 seconds. The lead surgeon stared at Nathan from across the sterile field. "How the hell did you know to bring a spare valve?" Nathan sealed his tool case and looked at the surgeon directly. "Because I reported this 3 times. No one listened." Joan looked down at her hands. They were steady. They were always steady during a case, but something behind her ribs was not. The scrub nurse stared at Nathan as if seeing him for the first time. The surgical tech quietly set down a retractor and did not pick it up again until the lead surgeon cleared his throat and told the room to refocus. No one in that operating room spoke for a long time after that. By the time Pratt learned what had happened in operating room 3, he had already written the narrative. The incident report he filed that afternoon listed the cause as transient equipment malfunction resolved during procedure. It made no mention of a servo valve replacement. It made no mention of the 3 prior reports. It made no mention of Nathan Mercer by name. That evening, Pratt went to the basement. He found Nathan alone in the equipment room, cleaning calibration probes under the fluorescent light. Pratt closed the door. His voice was low, stripped of the performance he wore upstairs. "You step out of line one more time, and I'll make sure you never work in any hospital in this state again. You're a technician, Mercer. Act like one." Nathan looked at him, said nothing. Pratt stood there for a moment, waiting for a reaction that did not come, and then he left. The next morning, Camille called Pratt to her temporary office on the 2nd floor. She asked about the operating room 3 incident. Pratt delivered his version smoothly: minor malfunction, resolved promptly, no patient impact, no systemic concern. Camille listened. She watched his hands as he spoke. They were perfectly still. Then she asked a question she had never asked at any of her 14 hospitals. The technician who was called in, what exactly did he do? Pratt waved it away. His job. Nothing more. Camille was not satisfied. But she did not say so. That afternoon, she did something she had never done at any of her hospitals. She went to the basement. Alone, she walked down the corridor past the laundry intake, past the storage cages, and stopped at the door to the biomedical equipment room. She opened it without knocking. The room was immaculate, not just organized, arranged with intention. Every tool in its place, every cable coiled and labeled. On the workbench, she saw hand-drawn circuit schematics of surgical equipment, ventilators, anesthesia units, and infusion pumps, rendered with a level of technical precision that belonged in an engineering department, not a hospital basement. In the margins, handwritten notes referenced pharmacological terms, hemodynamic thresholds, and drug interaction protocols, terms a technician would have no reason to know, terms a clinician would recognize instantly. Nathan was replacing a module on an infusion pump. He looked up when she entered but did not stand. Camille walked to the workbench. She studied the schematics for a moment, running her finger along the edge of a diagram that mapped the gas delivery pathway of an anesthesia unit with annotations about minimum alveolar concentration values. Then she turned to him. "The valve you replaced in OR3, you brought it with you. Why?" Nathan set down his screwdriver. "Because the machine was going to fail. It was a matter of when, not if." Camille took a step closer. "You reported it?" Nathan met her eyes. 3 times. She held the pause. "To whom?" Nathan looked at her, a long, deliberate look that carried no aggression but left no room for ambiguity. "To the person who just told you everything was fine." Camille understood. She turned and walked out without another word. But in the corridor, she stopped. She stood there for nearly a minute, staring at the concrete wall, processing what she had just heard. Then she took out her phone and called her assistant in Atlanta. That night, Camille did not sleep. She sat at the desk in her hotel room with her laptop open and the full equipment maintenance records for St. Albans Memorial glowing on the screen. 3 years of compliance data, pulled directly from the hospital's digital system. She reviewed them line by line. Every quarterly inspection report showed the same result. All equipment within normal operating parameters. No defects, no anomalies, no corrective actions required. For 36 consecutive months, across every surgical suite, every recovery unit, every ICU bed, a flawless record. Camille leaned back. She managed 14 hospitals. She knew what maintenance logs looked like at institutions with 400 beds, 200 pieces of critical equipment, and round-the-clock surgical schedules. A zero-defect record for 3 years was not evidence of excellence. It was evidence that someone had edited the data. The next afternoon, she returned to the basement. Nathan was waiting. He did not seem surprised to see her. Without speaking, he opened the bottom drawer of his workbench and placed a black notebook on the surface between them. He did not push it toward her. She reached for it herself. The notebook contained over 400 entries. Each one listed a date, an equipment serial number, a measured value taken by Nathan during his own independent calibration, and the corresponding value that appeared in the hospital's official maintenance log. The discrepancies ranged from minor 2 or 3% to critical. 14 entries were circled in red, including the anesthesia unit in operating room 3. Camille read in silence for several minutes, turning pages slowly, running her thumb along the entries. When she looked up, her face had changed. The corporate composure was still there, but beneath it was something harder and colder. "Why keep all this?" she asked. "Why not go to the state board?" Nathan answered without hesitation. "I went to the person in charge of this hospital 3 times. If the system inside doesn't work, the system outside doesn't know where to look." He paused. Then he added, "You own 14 hospitals. This is the only one with a 3-year zero-defect equipment log. That should have been your first question, not your last." The words landed like a blade laid flat across a table. Camille did not flinch, but she did not respond either. She closed the notebook, stood, and left. Back in her hotel room, she opened the hospital's HR database and pulled Nathan Mercer's personnel file. It was thin. Name, hire date, position, emergency contact his daughter. No prior employment history. No educational background, no certifications beyond the standard biomedical equipment technician credential. The file was not just sparse, it was deliberately empty. She opened a second browser tab and typed his full name into the National Practitioner Data Bank. The result loaded in 4 seconds. Dr. Nathan R. Mercer, former chief of neurosurgery, Johns Hopkins Medicine, youngest physician to to hold the position in the institution's history. 31 peer-reviewed publications in the Journal of Neurosurgery and the Annals of Neurology. Medical license, Maryland. Status, inactive. Voluntarily surrendered, 22. Camille closed the laptop slowly. She sat in the dark of her hotel room for a long time, staring at the wall above the desk. She thought about the man in the gray uniform in the basement, who read machines the way surgeons read patients. He read them that way because he was a surgeon, one of the best in the country. She did not confront Nathan. Not yet. She needed to understand one thing first: why a man like that would hide in a place like this, and whether Gerald Pratt knew what he had buried in his own basement. 8 days after Camille Ashford first set foot in St. Albans Memorial, Gerald Pratt called an emergency session of the hospital's executive board. The stated purpose was a safety review following the Operating Room 3 incident. The real purpose was preemption. Pratt had learned from an administrative assistant that Camille's team had requested the raw maintenance data files, not the summary reports he had curated, but the system-level access logs. He knew the walls were closing. His strategy was simple: control the narrative before Camille could build her own. He framed the agenda around what he called unauthorized procedural interference by non-clinical personnel, and he named Nathan Mercer as the subject. The boardroom filled by 9:45, department heads, senior nursing leadership, 2 hospital board members who had driven in from Atlanta. Camille sat at the far end of the table with a laptop open in front of her. She said nothing as people took their seats. Pratt stood at the head of the table and delivered his case with the smooth authority of a man who had practiced deception for so long it felt like fluency. The Operating Room 3 incident, he explained, was caused not by equipment failure, but by the unauthorized replacement of a critical component by a technician who had acted outside his scope. Nathan Mercer had bypassed standard protocol, failed to obtain written authorization, and compromised sterile procedure during an active surgery. Pratt recommended immediate termination. The department heads nodded. It sounded reasonable. It sounded clean. Camille watched. She did not speak. Nathan was brought into the room. He walked to the back wall and stood in the same spot he had stood weeks before. Gray uniform, hands at his sides, face unreadable. Pratt turned to him, voice rising just enough for performance. Did you or did you not replace a component in OR3 without written authorization from the director's office? Nathan's answer was 2 words: I did. Pratt spread his hands toward Camille. There you have it. Pratt pressed further. He looked around the room and repeated the line that had worked so well before. This is what happens when we let a wrench-turner question certified surgeons. A few people laughed, not as many as last time. The words sounded different now. Thinner. Then the door opened. Sophie Mercer walked in holding a still damp watercolor painting of a sunset over marshland, her canvas bag slung over one shoulder. Doctor. Joan Whitfield stood in the doorway behind her. She had picked the girl up from art class when Nathan was pulled into the emergency meeting without notice. Joan was the only person Nathan had ever trusted enough to ask. Sophie scanned the room. She saw her father standing alone at the far wall, while a room full of strangers sat in leather chairs staring at him. She did not understand what was happening, but she saw him, and her face broke into a smile. She walked straight to him, held up the painting, and said it clearly, brightly, without any idea of what she was detonating. Dr. Mercer, look what I made! Every sound in that room stopped. The air conditioning hum seemed to disappear. Pratt turned slowly. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The department heads looked at each other. One of the board members from Atlanta leaned forward in his chair. Nathan looked down at his daughter. He placed his hand gently on the top of her head. Then he looked up directly at Pratt and said nothing. Camille stood. Her voice was calm, factual, and carried the weight of something she had verified and re-verified the night before. She called him by his title, Dr. Nathan Mercer, former chief of neurosurgery, Johns Hopkins Medicine, 31 published papers. I verified it myself. The silence that followed was absolute. It filled the room the way water fills a glass completely, without a single air pocket left. Joan stepped forward quietly and placed her hand on Sophie's shoulder. She whispered something to the girl, and Sophie looked up at her father once more, smiled the kind of smile that only a child who trusts completely can produce, and let Joan guide her out of the boardroom. In the hallway, Joan sat beside her on a bench near the window. Sophie opened her canvas bag, pulled out a set of colored pencils, and began adding details to her marshland painting. She hummed softly. She was safe. She was calm. She did not know what she had just changed. Inside the boardroom, Pratt scrambled. "Whatever his background," he said, his voice tighter now, losing its polish, the silver-haired composure cracking at the edges, "he is currently employed as a technician. His credentials are irrelevant to the fact that he violated protocol." Nathan spoke. For the first time in the 3 years he had worked at St. Albans Memorial, he spoke in a room full of people without being interrupted. His voice was low and even. Every word was precise. 14%. That's how far the pressure in OR3 deviated from safe operating range. I reported it on March 9th, April 22nd, and May 6th. All 3 reports were submitted through the hospital's internal compliance system. All 3 were closed without corrective action. Your signature, Dr. Pratt, is on every closure. He reached into the chest pocket of his uniform and placed a USB drive on the table. This contains 3 years of data. My independent calibration readings for every piece of critical equipment in this hospital matched against the values recorded in the official maintenance log. Every entry I logged has a corresponding original reading. Every entry in the hospital system has been altered. He paused. His voice did not rise. The security camera in the basement corridor recorded who accessed the maintenance terminal after hours to make those alterations. Camille plugged the USB into her laptop. The room watched the screen. She opened the video folder first. The footage was black and white, time-stamped and unmistakable. Gerald Pratt, alone, sitting at the workstation in the biomedical equipment room at 11:14 on a Tuesday night, scrolling through calibration records and manually editing values, then again on a Thursday, 3 weeks later, then again, and again. The timestamps matched the dates in Nathan's notebook, with perfect precision. Camille opened the financial file next. Her assistant had compiled it overnight at her request. The equipment maintenance budget for St. Albans Memorial had been reduced by 60% over 3 years. The difference, nearly $1.2 million, had been redirected into a discretionary fund, listed as the Hospital Innovation Fund. The fund had no oversight committee, no project deliverables, no external audit trail, no receipts. It was controlled by one signatory, Gerald Pratt. Pratt stood up. His face was the color of the wall behind him. "This is fabricated." Nathan looked at him. The room was so quiet that when Nathan exhaled, it was audible. And then he spoke the words that no one in that boardroom would ever forget. "My wife died on a table connected to a machine just like the one in OR3, a machine that drifted, a hospital that knew, a director who signed off. I came here because I swore I would never let that happen to someone else's family. You almost made me break that promise." No one breathed. No one moved. A department head at the far end of the table pressed her hand over her mouth. One of the board members from Atlanta closed his eyes and did not open them for a long time. Pratt sat down. He placed both hands flat on the table as if the surface were the only thing keeping him from sliding to the floor. His mouth moved once, forming a word that never arrived. Then it closed. He stared at the wood grain between his fingers and did not look up again. He did not speak again. Camille picked up her phone. She made 2 calls in front of the entire room, her voice steady and clear. The first was to Ashford Healthcare Group's general counsel. The second was to the Georgia Composite Medical Board. Gerald Pratt was suspended immediately, effective that moment. His access credentials were revoked. His office was sealed. A formal investigation was opened before the room was dismissed. When the department heads filed out, not one of them looked at Pratt. They looked at Nathan. Every single one. 1 week later, St. Albans Memorial was operating under direct oversight from Ashford Healthcare Group's Central Compliance Division. Every piece of surgical equipment in the hospital had been inspected, recalibrated, and certified against independent benchmarks The same benchmarks Nathan Mercer had been using quietly for 3 years in a basement room that no one visited. Dr. Joan Whitfield was appointed interim clinical director. On her first morning in the role, she found Nathan in the equipment room, running a routine diagnostic on a ventilator as if nothing had changed. She stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "I should have spoken up sooner." Nathan did not look up from the screen. "You're speaking now. That's what matters." Gerald Pratt was indicted 6 weeks later on 12 counts of fraud, falsification of medical safety records, and reckless endangerment. The Georgia Composite Medical Board suspended his medical license pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. He did not return to St. Albans Memorial. Camille came to the basement one last time on a Thursday afternoon. Nathan was calibrating a new anesthesia unit that had been delivered that morning, a replacement for the machine in operating room 3. She stood beside his workbench and waited until he finished the reading he was taking. "I have an offer," she said. "Director of Medical Equipment Safety. Across all 14 hospitals, you would build the program from scratch. Report directly to me." Nathan set down his calibration tool. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the fluorescent light above them buzzed through 2 full cycles. Then he said, "I'll think about it." Camille nodded. She turned toward the door and stopped. Without looking back, she said, "For what it's worth, I should have asked about that zero-defect log on day 1. I didn't. That's on me." Nathan looked at her, at the back of her head, at the line of her shoulders, at the way she stood still, and let the silence hold the weight of what she had just admitted. He nodded once. She did not see it, but she felt it. There was nothing romantic between them, no declaration. No lingering glance held a beat too long. There was something rarer and harder to name. Respect, the kind that is not given freely or claimed by title, but built slowly, through watching someone do the right thing when every incentive pointed the other way. That evening, Nathan drove to the Savannah Arts Academy Annex and parked in the same spot he always used. Sophie came out with her canvas bag and a new painting, this one of the Savannah River at dusk, the water done in 7 shades of blue that her teacher said were the best in the class. She climbed into the truck, buckled her seatbelt, and started talking about how she had mixed the cerulean with just enough white to make it glow. They walked into the house together. Nathan started pulling things from the refrigerator while Sophie sat on the counter, swinging her legs. She was quiet for a moment, watching him, and then she asked, "Dad, are you going to be a doctor again?" Nathan stopped. He looked at his daughter, her cerulean-streaked cheek, her serious eyes, her paint-stained fingers resting on the edge of the counter. He smiled. It was small and real, and it reached his eyes. "Maybe," he said. "But first, what are we making for dinner?" Sophie grinned. She started listing ingredients, counting them on her fingers, arguing with herself about whether they had enough garlic. Nathan listened. He reached into his back pocket and opened his wallet. The photograph was still there, the 2 of them in white coats, the Hopkins logo behind them, the life he had walked away from and the woman he had walked away from it for. He looked at it for 1 extra second, then he closed the wallet and put it back. Outside, the Savannah sky was turning the color of Sophie's painting. The streetlights had not come on yet. The air smelled like saltgrass and something blooming in the neighbor's yard. Nathan Mercer stood in his kitchen with his daughter and let the evening settle around them like something he had earned. Neither of them had been looking.